The Pacific Ocean covers approximately 1/3 of the surface of the Earth. It is larger than all of the world's landmasses combined. At its widest point, from the coast of Indonesia to the coast of Colombia, it spans more than 19,000 kilometers, nearly half the circumference of the planet. The distances between the island groups scattered across its surface are vast almost beyond comprehension. Hawaii is more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest Polynesian island group, and Easter Island is more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land in any direction. The Pacific is not just the largest body of water on Earth. It is, by any reasonable measure, the largest empty space on the surface of the planet. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel to the achievements that reframe everything we thought we knew, to the moments when human beings did something that by every conventional measure of what was possible should not have been done, and did it not by accident but by design, not once but hundreds of times. This vast, empty, improbable ocean was colonized by human beings. Not by a lucky accident, not by a few survivors clinging to a log who happened to be blown to an island they did not know existed. Colonized systematically, deliberately, by navigators who set out knowing where they were going, who found what they were looking for, and who made the return voyage to report what they had found. The people who achieved this were the Polynesian navigators, and the tradition they represented, the tradition of wayfinding, of navigating the open ocean without instruments, by the stars, the waves, the clouds, and the birds, is one of the greatest intellectual and practical achievements in the history of our species. It is also a tradition that was nearly lost entirely, and that survives today in a form that took extraordinary effort to preserve. The story of how the Polynesians colonized the Pacific, and of how the knowledge that made that colonization possible was almost extinguished and then partially recovered, is a story about different kinds of knowledge, different ways of knowing the world, and the specific vulnerabilities of knowledge systems that are carried in the minds of practitioners rather than in the pages of books. It is a story that asks what it means to navigate, and what it means to know where you are, and whether the instruments we use to answer those questions are the same thing as the answers themselves. There is something deeply vertiginous about imagining a Polynesian navigator at sea in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No land visible in any direction. No instruments. No charts. 3,000 kilometers to the nearest island group in one direction, 4,000 in another. And yet the navigator is not lost. They know precisely where they are. Or rather, they know something more useful than their precise coordinates. They know the direction and distance to their destination, and they know what they need to do to get there. They carry the map not in their hands, but in their minds. A map built not of lines on paper, but of stars and swells and the behavior of birds. A map that is always current because it is being continuously updated by the sensory information pouring in from the environment around them. A map that is always current because it is being continuously updated by the sensory information pouring in from the environment around them. The cognitive achievement this represents is not fully appreciated until you try to imagine performing it yourself. Stand on the deck of a canoe in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, out of sight of land in every direction, and try to know where you are. Without a GPS device, without a chart, without a compass, without a sextant. Try to know where you are from the stars, the waves, and the birds. The knowledge that allows a trained navigator to perform this feat fluently and reliably over a career of many years and many voyages is extraordinary. And it is extraordinary not because it requires innate gifts unavailable to most people, but because it requires the patient accumulation of environmental knowledge that most people in the modern world never have the opportunity or the incentive to develop. The navigators were not superhuman. They were people who had spent their lives learning to read the world in a way that their civilization required of them. The achievement this represents is not just geographical, not just the colonization of the Pacific, impressive as that is. It is cognitive. The traditional Polynesian navigator possessed a model of the ocean environment so detailed, so comprehensive, and so reliably accurate that it could substitute entirely for the external instruments and charts that Western navigators considered indispensable. Understanding how that model was built and how it worked is one of the most interesting questions in the study of human knowledge, and the answers have changed how cognitive scientists think about the relationship between different forms of intelligence. The settlement of the Pacific Islands was one of the most remarkable geographical achievements in human history, and the full extent of what the Polynesian navigators accomplished is only fully apparent when the numbers are laid out. The first human settlement of the Pacific began with the Lapita people, a culture that emerged in the Bismarck Archipelago north of Papua New Guinea approximately 3,500 years ago, and whose distinctive pottery and genetic lineage can be traced across the western Pacific as their descendants moved from island group to island group. The initial westward expansion from Southeast Asia had been underway for tens of thousands of years. The first modern humans reached Australia by crossing open water approximately 65,000 years ago, a crossing that required some form of watercraft and some form of navigation. But the Lapita expansion into the Central Pacific represented a qualitative leap in nautical capability. The islands of the Central and Eastern Pacific are separated by distances that require weeks of open ocean sailing, entirely out of sight of land, in conditions where a navigational error of more than a degree or two in a 1,000-kilometer crossing would mean missing the target island entirely. The Polynesian expansion from Tonga and Samoa into the Central and Eastern Pacific accelerated approximately 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, in what archaeologists and linguists call the Polynesian dispersal. Within a few centuries, human populations had reached the Marquesas Islands, the Society Islands including Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and eventually the three most remote corners of the Polynesian Triangle: Hawaii to the north, Easter Island to the east, and New Zealand to the southwest. The distances involved are extraordinary. From the Society Islands to Hawaii is approximately 4,000 kilometers. From the Society Islands to Easter Island is approximately 4,000 kilometers in a different direction. From the Society Islands to New Zealand is approximately 4,000 kilometers in yet another direction. The Polynesians found all three of these remote destinations, established permanent settlements on all of them, and maintained regular contact between them for centuries before the introduction of European navigation. The scale of this achievement is what makes it difficult to explain as anything other than systematic, skilled, intentional navigation. The islands of the Polynesian Triangle are small relative to the ocean that surrounds them. Hawaii is a chain of islands in the middle of a vast oceanic emptiness, discoverable only by someone who knew in roughly which direction to look and who was capable of covering the distance required to reach it. The probability that any given random voyage departing from the Society Islands would find Hawaii by chance is vanishingly small. The probability that multiple voyages found it, that return voyages were made, and that regular contact was maintained for centuries is for all practical purposes zero unless the navigators knew what they were doing. The archaeological evidence for the extent of Polynesian contact across the Pacific has grown steadily stronger over the past few decades, and some of its most striking elements concern contact with the Americas, contacts that the settlement of Easter Island and the Hawaiian Islands would have put within sailing range. The sweet potato, which is native to South America, was present in Polynesia well before European contact. Carbon dating of sweet potato remains from archaeological sites in the Cook Islands and elsewhere confirms its presence before 1000 CE, centuries before any European contact could have introduced it. The sweet potato could not have reached Polynesia by natural dispersal. Someone carried it. The most parsimonious explanation is that Polynesian navigators reached the coast of South America, encountered the sweet potato, and brought it back, a voyage of approximately 7,000 kilometers across the open Pacific that would represent an even more extraordinary navigation feat than the Hawaii or Easter Island crossings. Recent ancient DNA analysis of chicken bones from an archaeological site in Chile provides additional evidence. The bones date to the pre-Columbian period and show a genetic signature consistent with Polynesian chickens rather than the European varieties that would have been introduced after contact. The Polynesians appear to have reached the Americas and left behind both cultural and biological traces of their presence. The genetic evidence from the Polynesian populations themselves confirms the extraordinary geographical reach of their navigations. Ancient and modern DNA studies of Pacific Islander populations show the genetic signatures of founding populations, serial colonization events, and long-distance mixing that are consistent with the archaeological evidence for the settlement sequences of specific island groups. The genetic evidence from Easter Island is particularly interesting. A 2020 study found evidence of genetic mixing between Polynesian and Native American populations that occurred approximately 1200 CE, consistent with the proposed date of first Polynesian contact with South America, and confirming that the contact was not just a visit but an event substantial enough to leave a detectable genetic signature in the island's population. The knowledge system that Polynesian navigators used to cross the Pacific, the system that modern scholars call wayfinding, was not a simple set of rules or a basic understanding of the compass directions of the stars. It was a comprehensive model of the ocean environment, encoded in memory and transmitted through oral tradition, that allowed a trained navigator to determine their position and maintain their course in conditions of complete disorientation. The stars were the navigator's primary reference system. The Polynesian star compass divided the horizon into 32 bearing points, each defined by the rising or setting position of a specific star or group of stars. A navigator who had memorized the rising and setting positions of several hundred stars, their positions throughout the night at different seasons, their relative positions to each other, the constellations that served as reference points, had a reference system that could provide a bearing at any moment of the night when stars were visible. The rotation of the sky as the night progressed meant that different stars were available at different times of night, and the seasonal progression of the sky meant that different constellations were dominant at different times of year. A fully trained navigator had internalized a mental model of the sky that was always, at any moment, telling them where they were relative to the horizon. But the stars are only available when the sky is clear, and the Pacific sky is not always clear. Clouds, storms, and overcast conditions could eliminate the stellar reference for hours or days at a time. The wayfinding system had extensive backup mechanisms for these conditions. The pattern of ocean swells, the long-period waves that propagate across the Pacific from distant storm systems, maintaining their direction even after the wind that generated them has died, provided a reference that was available day and night regardless of cloud cover. An experienced navigator could feel the swell pattern through the motion of the canoe, identifying its direction and period by the specific feel of the hull's movement, and maintaining their course relative to the swell even in complete darkness and total cloud cover. The rising of the stars, the setting of the sun, the direction of the wind and the swell, all of these were cross-referenced against each other and against the navigator's dead reckoning estimate of their current position. A discrepancy between two sources of positional information was a signal that something had changed, that the swell had shifted, or that a current was pushing the canoe off course, or that they had traveled far enough that the stellar bearings had changed, and required the navigator to update their mental model of where they were and where they were going. Wayfinding was not a passive process of reading the environment. It was an active, continuous process of hypothesis testing, model updating, and decision-making that drew simultaneously on multiple information sources and never rested. The training required to become a fully qualified navigator in the traditional Polynesian or Carolinian system took years of dedicated study under an experienced master and was considered one of the most demanding intellectual achievements within the culture. The knowledge was not just extensive, it was interconnected in ways that required deep understanding rather than simple memorization. A navigator who had memorized the star compass but did not understand how the swells interacted with islands would make errors that a navigator who understood both would not. A navigator who understood the stellar reference but could not read the clouds would be helpless on overcast days. The full knowledge was a system, and functioning within it required not just the components but the connections between them. The specific body of knowledge required for a single long-distance voyage was daunting even by the standards of modern navigational training. A navigator planning a voyage from the Society Islands to Hawaii needed to know the star paths appropriate for the outbound and return courses, the swell systems that would be encountered at different stages of the voyage and their expected behavior, the wind systems of the tropical Pacific and their seasonal variations, the specific cloud and bird indicators for each island group along or near the route, the current systems that would affect the canoe's speed and course, the hazards, shoals, unpredictable currents, seasonally violent weather at specific points along the route, and the contingency strategies for conditions that deviated from the expected pattern. All of this had to be carried in memory, available for instant recall in the stress and fatigue of open ocean passage, and continuously cross-referenced against the actual conditions being observed. The mental workload of open ocean navigation under traditional methods is not easily appreciated from the perspective of modern GPS navigation, where the navigator's primary job is to consult a screen that shows their position and course with effortless precision. Traditional navigation demanded continuous attention, continuous integration of multiple information streams, and continuous decision-making. The navigators who performed these feats were not performing a routine task. They were engaged in one of the most intellectually demanding activities that any human culture has ever made a routine requirement of daily life. The deep ocean swells of the Pacific are one of the most remarkable natural reference systems available to an open ocean navigator, and the way Polynesian navigators use them reveals a sensitivity to physical phenomena that modern oceanography has only recently been able to describe in quantitative terms. Ocean swells are generated by storm systems thousands of kilometers away and propagate across the ocean surface in coherent wave trains whose direction, period, and height carry specific information about the conditions that generated them. In the Pacific, the dominant swell systems come from specific geographic sources. The southern swells generated by the storm systems of the Southern Ocean, the northeast swells generated by the trade winds of the North Pacific, and the various local swells generated by nearby weather systems. A navigator who knew the characteristic direction, period, and feel of each major swell system had a reference grid that covered the entire ocean, and that was available even in the absence of any visual cues. The use of swells for navigation required more than the ability to identify the direction of a swell. It required an understanding of how swells interact with islands, how a large island deflects and refracts the swell patterns around it, creating zones of confusion and disruption in the swell that a navigator could detect and use to locate the island before it was visible over the horizon. The ability to read the island's swell shadow, the pattern of disrupted waves that indicates the presence of a large landmass in the direction from which the swell is being deflected, could extend the effective range of navigation by tens to hundreds of kilometers beyond the visual range. An island that would be visible only within 30 kilometers to a person at sea level could be located by its swell shadow from 200 or 300 kilometers away, allowing the navigator to adjust their course well before visual contact was made. The physical mechanism of island-generated swell disturbance is now well understood in oceanographic terms. When a long-period swell encounters a large island, the island refracts the wave energy around its margins, like a stone in a river creating eddies, and creates a zone of reduced wave height directly behind the island and characteristic interference patterns at the margins where the diffracted wave energy meets the undisturbed wave energy on either side. The specific pattern of these interference effects depends on the size and shape of the island and on the period and wavelength of the incident swell, and an experienced navigator who knew the characteristic swell pattern for a specific island could identify that island's presence from the pattern of disturbance even without visual contact. The practice of searching for an island by feeling for its swell signature, of deliberately lying down in the hull of the canoe to feel the subtle changes in the wave pattern through the body rather than reading them by eye, is described in the accounts of experienced navigators and illustrates the extent to which wayfinding was a whole-body sensory experience rather than a purely visual one. The navigator did not just observe the ocean. They felt it, smelled it, heard it, and tasted it, the specific chemical signature of water near land, the change in smell as the vegetation and soil of an island came within range of the wind, the sound of surf breaking on a reef in the darkness before the reef came into visual range. Every sensory channel contributed to the continuous model of the environment that wayfinding required. The navigators of the Caroline Islands in Micronesia developed this swell reading capability into a systematic body of knowledge called ITAC, a conceptual system for tracking position during a voyage that treated the navigator's canoe as stationary and the islands as moving past it. In the ITAC system, the navigator held in their mind the position of a reference island behind them, and tracked its movement past the bearing points of the star compass as the voyage progressed. The reference island was not actually visible. It might be hundreds of kilometers away, but its position was tracked by dead reckoning, and its movement relative to the star compass positions served as a running estimate of the canoe's progress along the route. The ITAC system is a striking example of how a different conceptual framework for understanding position and motion can produce a more practical and more effective navigation system than the European framework that treats the navigator as moving and the landscape as stationary. The ITAC system's conceptual elegance is matched by its practical robustness. Because the navigator tracks relative position rather than absolute position, small errors do not accumulate in the same way that dead reckoning errors accumulate in the European system. If the navigator's estimate of the canoe's speed or current correction is slightly wrong, the error affects the estimated position of the reference island. But as long as the estimate is reasonable, the navigator knows roughly where they are and can correct when new information becomes available. The system is self-correcting in a way that the European dead reckoning system is not. Any new observation, a star rising in an unexpected position, a swell coming from a direction that disagrees with the expected pattern, immediately provides information for updating the mental model and improving the position estimate. The navigator who stays alert and integrates all available information is continuously improving their estimate, rather than accumulating error from a single starting point. The navigator's ability to read the natural environment extended well beyond the stars and the swells, into a repertoire of biological and meteorological indicators that provided additional information about position and the proximity of land. The behavior of seabirds was among the most important of these indicators. Different species of seabirds have different ranges and habits, and a navigator who knew which species roost on which islands, how far from land they typically flew, and in which direction they flew at dawn and at dusk, had a biological compass that could locate an island from distances of 1 to 200 kilometers. The golden plover, which makes annual migrations across the Pacific from Alaska to Hawaii, follows specific routes that served as navigational guides for Polynesian navigators making the same crossing. The frigate bird, which cannot land on water and must return to land each night, flies toward land in the late afternoon. Following a frigate bird in the afternoon is following a reliable guide toward the nearest island. Clouds over islands have distinctive characteristics that differ from clouds over open ocean. The convective currents generated by the warmer land surface beneath a tropical island produce cumulus clouds that tend to form and persist over the island even when the surrounding ocean is clear. The shape, height, and persistence of these clouds can indicate the presence and rough size of an island from distances of 60 to 100 kilometers, well beyond visual range of the island itself. A green tint on the underside of a cloud indicates vegetation below, reflected in the cloud's base. An experienced navigator could read these cloud signatures and locate an island that was beyond the horizon. The color and temperature of the water also provided information about position. The currents that flow between island groups carry water of different temperatures, colors, and biological contents that can be detected by an experienced observer. The boundary between the warm, blue, relatively lifeless water of the central ocean gyres and the cooler, greener, more productive water near major currents or island chains is detectable by color and by the change in biological productivity, in the types of fish visible near the surface, in the plankton blooms that color the water, in the presence of particular species of jellyfish or other marine organisms that are associated with specific current systems. A navigator who had traveled the same routes many times accumulated a detailed sensory map of the ocean environment that enriched and confirmed the astronomical and hydrological references. The luminescence of the ocean at night, the bioluminescence produced by microscopic marine organisms that glow when disturbed by a wave or a hull, was another information source that experienced navigators could read. Different concentrations and species of bioluminescent organisms are associated with different ocean environments, and the pattern of luminescence visible from a canoe at night could indicate proximity to specific current boundaries or island chains. The Polynesian navigators' practice of trailing a hand in the water at night, feeling the temperature and the luminescence, was not merely sensory pleasure but information gathering, another input to the continuous model of position and environment that wayfinding required. The navigation knowledge also included extensive astronomical knowledge beyond the star compass, knowledge of the moon's monthly cycle and its effect on the tides, knowledge of the visible planets and their movements through the constellations, knowledge of specific astronomical phenomena, meteor showers, the heliacal rising of specific stars at specific times of year, that served as seasonal calendar markers. The star Arcturus rises exactly over Hawaii from the latitude of Tahiti, and its rise was traditionally used as a course indicator for the Hawaii voyage. The Pleiades, rising in the east and setting in the west, served as a directional reference throughout the Pacific. The Southern Cross, always circling close to the south celestial pole, provided a reliable south indicator throughout the southern Pacific. Each of these facts had to be known not just as an isolated piece of information but as part of an integrated astronomical model that could be applied in the specific conditions of any given night at any given latitude. The specific conditions of any given night at any given latitude. The knowledge of how the night sky changes with latitude, how the stars shift in their rising and setting positions as the canoe moves north or south, how the pole star rises higher above the horizon as the canoe moves north and lower as it moves south, how certain stars that are always visible in the tropics disappear below the southern horizon as the canoe moves north, was one of the most important tools for tracking the canoe's north-south position during a voyage. A navigator who knew the limiting latitudes of specific stars, the latitudes at which they just touched the horizon at their transit, had a set of natural latitude indicators that required no measurement and no instruments. When a specific star just barely clears the horizon at transit, the navigator knows they are at the specific latitude associated with that star. This technique, independently developed by Polynesian, Arab, and Norse navigators, is the conceptual foundation of the instrumental latitude measurement that European navigators would later formalize with the astrolabe and the sextant. The voyaging canoes that the Polynesian navigators used for their open ocean crossings were engineering achievements of the first order, vessels specifically designed for the conditions of the Pacific and capable of performance that modern naval architects have struggled to match in vessels of comparable size and materials. The double-hulled voyaging canoe, the Wa'e Kaulua in Hawaiian, the Va'a Tela in Samoan, consisted of two hulls connected by a platform of wooden crossbeams and decking. The hulls were carved from large tree trunks and shaped to a hydrodynamic profile that allowed both speed and seakeeping, the ability to maintain forward progress and stability in the large swells and variable winds of the open Pacific. The double-hull configuration provided the stability needed for long ocean passages, the carrying capacity needed for colonization voyages with crew, provisions, plants, and animals, and the speed needed to make the lengthy crossings in reasonable time while the provisions lasted. The construction of these canoes required the integration of sophisticated material knowledge, the selection of specific tree species for their combination of strength, weight, and water resistance, the processing of the wood to prevent cracking and rot, the treatment of the hull surfaces to reduce friction, the selection and processing of the plant fibers used for lashing and sails, with the engineering knowledge of hull shape, rigging, and sailing technique that had been accumulated over generations of Pacific voyaging. The sails were made from woven pandanus leaf mats, and the rigging was made from plant fibers processed into cordage of considerable strength and flexibility. The entire canoe was built without metal tools. In the absence of iron, The woodworking was done with stone adzes, shark teeth rasps, and coral abrasives, and yet the resulting vessels were capable of making oceanic passages of thousands of kilometers in conditions that would challenge modern sailing yachts. The performance of reconstructed Polynesian voyaging canoes in modern sea trials has provided remarkable data on what the original vessels were capable of. The Hokule, a Hawaiian voyaging canoe built in 1975 by the Polynesian Voyaging Society and sailed extensively since then under traditional navigation, has demonstrated sustained speeds of 8 to 10 knots in favorable conditions, with the ability to sail efficiently at angles as close as 75 degrees to the wind. Performance characteristics that compare favorably with modern sailing vessels of similar waterline length. The structural integrity of the double-hull design in heavy weather has also been validated by the Hokule's voyages, which have included passages in conditions that tested the vessel's seakeeping to the limit. The provisioning of long-distance voyaging canoes for colonization voyages, the voyages that carried founding populations to new islands, was a logistics challenge of remarkable complexity. A colonization voyage carried not just crew and provisions for the crossing but the genetic and cultural foundation for a new community. Breeding pairs of pigs, chickens, and dogs, planting stock of the food crops that would sustain the colony, water containers for the crossing and containers that would become household equipment on arrival, fishing equipment for the voyage and for the new settlement, tools for building shelters and working the land, and the full range of cultural materials. Seeds for fiber plants, cuttings from medicinal herbs, ceremonial objects, the oral traditions that encoded the community's history and knowledge, that the new colony would need to establish itself as a viable community rather than just a group of survivors. The coordination required to plan and provision a colonization voyage, to determine what to bring and how much, to acquire the breeding animals and the planting stock, to build or repair the canoes, to assemble the crew, to choose the season and the weather window for departure, and to decide on the destination, required sophisticated organizational capacity and long-term planning. The colonization voyages were not spontaneous adventures. They were planned expeditions, organized by communities with the institutional capacity and the social authority to mobilize the resources needed for a voyage whose preparation might take months and whose costs would be borne by the entire community. The navigators who led these voyages were not just technically skilled, they were leaders of complex social enterprises, responsible for the survival of the community they were bringing to a new home. The choice of destination for a colonization voyage was itself a significant decision, informed by prior knowledge and scouting voyages. The colonization of Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, the three most remote corners of the Polynesian Triangle, were almost certainly preceded by earlier voyages that located the islands without establishing permanent settlements, allowing the navigators to return home with the information needed to plan the colonization voyage. The scouting voyages were not accidental discoveries but deliberate explorations, sent in directions that the navigators had reason to believe might contain habitable land, based on the migration patterns of birds, the drift of vegetation, and the general knowledge of the ocean environment accumulated from previous voyages. The systematic exploration of the Pacific was not a random walk through uncertainty but a directed search based on environmental intelligence. The academic debate over whether the Polynesian settlement of the Pacific was deliberate or accidental, whether the navigators were skilled wayfinders or lucky castaways, was one of the most contentious disputes in the history of anthropology, and its resolution reveals as much about the biases of European scholarship as it does about the capabilities of Polynesian navigators. The accidental drift theory, associated most prominently with the anthropologist Andrew Sharp, was proposed in 1956 in a book that argued that the distances and sailing conditions involved in Polynesian voyaging made deliberate two-way navigation impossible, and that the settlement of the Pacific Islands must therefore have been achieved through one-way accidental drifts. Voyagers blown off course by storms who happened to land on distant islands and were stranded there, unable to return. Sharp's argument drew on calculations of drift rates in Pacific currents and on the assumed limitations of Polynesian navigation, and it was widely accepted in the academic community for several decades. The the drift theory's weaknesses are now well understood and widely acknowledged. The most fundamental problem is that it cannot explain the return voyages. The settlement of distant island groups was not a one-way event, but the establishment of regular contact that resulted in the exchange of people, plants, animals, and cultural practices between island groups thousands of kilometers apart. The archaeological and genetic evidence of this contact, the spread of specific plant varieties, the genetic mixing of island populations, the distribution of specific cultural practices, is consistent only with deliberate two-way navigation, not with one-way accidental drift. The computer simulation studies that were conducted in the 1970s to test the drift hypothesis produced results that were highly unfavorable to it. The simulations modeled the drift behavior of canoes with no navigation capability, subject only to the winds and currents of the Pacific, and calculated the probability of any given canoe reaching specific island groups by passive drift from specific starting points. The results showed that passive drift from the known or probable origins of Pacific settlement would reach most of the Polynesian Triangle's major island groups with very low probability. For some islands, the probability of passive drift colonization from the most likely source was less than 1% even over thousands of simulated voyages. For Hawaii, with its position far to the north of the main Polynesian dispersal routes, the probability was essentially zero. The simulations of active navigation, canoes steered by navigators using the traditional wayfinding methods, produced very different results. When the simulations were programmed with knowledge of the star compass and the dominant wind and current systems, and when they were allowed to adjust course in response to environmental information, the success rates for reaching specific island groups from specific starting points were much higher, typically above 50% for experienced navigators on well-traveled routes. The comparison of the active and passive navigation simulations provided quantitative confirmation of what the archaeological and genetic evidence already indicated. The settlement of the Pacific was deliberate, skilled, and systematic. The second problem with the drift theory is that it rests on a demonstrably false premise about the capabilities of Polynesian navigation. The revival of traditional wayfinding, the successful navigation of reconstructed voyaging canoes across the Pacific using traditional methods, and the systematic study of the wayfinding knowledge still preserved in the Caroline Islands and other Micronesian and Polynesian communities have demonstrated conclusively that the traditional navigation system was capable of the distances and the precision required for the settlement voyages. The drift theory was not based on evidence that the Polynesians could not navigate the distances involved. It was based on the assumption that they could not, which is a very different thing, and an assumption that reflects the long-standing European tendency to underestimate the technical and intellectual capabilities of non-European peoples. The specific intellectual tradition within which Sharp's drift hypothesis was accepted so readily is worth examining, because it reveals something important about the sociology of academic knowledge. The drift hypothesis was not based on rigorous analysis of the navigation evidence. It was based on the presumption that the Polynesians could not have navigated the relevant distances with the available technology. This presumption was not stated explicitly. It was implicit in the framework of assumptions within which the evidence was evaluated. The navigators were assumed to lack the knowledge, because the knowledge they would have needed was assumed to be beyond the reach of pre-industrial Pacific peoples. The assumption was false, but it was embedded in a broader intellectual tradition that routinely underestimated non-European technical achievement, and it is this tradition that made the drift hypothesis credible to so many scholars for so long. The near extinction of traditional Polynesian navigation in the 20th century, and the extraordinary effort required to partially recover it, is one of the most poignant stories in the history of indigenous knowledge. European contact with the Pacific Islands, beginning in the 16th century and accelerating through the 18th and 19th centuries, disrupted the social structures, the educational systems, and the cultural practices that had transmitted the wayfinding knowledge from one generation to the next. The suppression of indigenous cultures by colonial authorities and Christian missionaries, the introduction of European navigation technology that made traditional methods appear obsolete, and the demographic catastrophe of epidemic diseases that killed large fractions of Pacific Island populations, in some cases more than 90% within a century of first contact, all contributed to the erosion of the traditional knowledge systems. The demographic catastrophe was the most fundamental factor. Knowledge transmitted through oral tradition is maintained by living practitioners, and when the practitioners die faster than they can transmit the knowledge dies with them. The Pacific Islands experienced exactly this scenario in the 19th century, as populations that had been stable for centuries were decimated by measles, smallpox, influenza, and other epidemic diseases to which they had no prior exposure and no immune resistance. Communities that had maintained the full range of traditional knowledge for generations, navigation, medicine, agriculture, oral history, ceremonial practice, were reduced to fractions of their former size in the space of a single generation, and the elderly knowledge holders who died were often irreplaceable. The knowledge they carried was not written down, and it died with them. The colonial educational system compounded the demographic loss by systematically devaluing indigenous knowledge and replacing it with Western alternatives. Children who attended colonial schools were taught European navigation, European medicine, European history, and European religion, and they were explicitly or implicitly taught that the traditional knowledge of their own cultures was inferior, superstitious, or simply irrelevant in a world organized around European technology and European institutions. The internalization of this message by educated Pacific Islanders, who often came to see their own traditional knowledge through the colonial lens and dismissed it as primitive, was one of the most destructive effects of colonialism on indigenous knowledge systems. More damaging in some ways than the direct suppression, because it made the knowledge seem not worth preserving even to the people who carried it. By the mid-20th century, traditional wayfinding navigation had nearly disappeared from most of Polynesia. The last practitioners of the old navigation systems in many island groups were elderly men and women who had no students, because the younger generations had been educated in Western schools that taught European navigation methods and denigrated traditional knowledge. The specific body of knowledge required to navigate the Pacific without instruments, the star compass, the swell reading, the cloud and bird lore, the attack system, was close to disappearing entirely from living practice. The recovery effort that began in the 1970s was driven by a combination of cultural revitalization movements in Hawaii and other Polynesian societies, the determination of a small group of navigators and scholars who recognized what was at risk, and a decision to rebuild a traditional Hawaiian voyaging canoe and sail it to Tahiti using traditional navigation. The canoe was the Hockulay, and the navigator who made the first voyage in 1976 was Mau-Pielug, a master navigator from the Caroline island of Satawal who was, at the time, one of the last people alive who possessed the complete traditional navigation knowledge in its full form. Mau-Pielug had been trained in the traditional system by his grandfather, had continued to practice it throughout his life, and was willing, after significant persuasion, to teach it to a new generation of students who would carry it back to Hawaii and the wider Polynesian world. The role of Mau-Pielug's son, Cesario Surler, in continuing the Satawal navigation tradition in the Caroline Islands is an important element of the story that is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on the Hawaiian revival. The navigation tradition of Satawal was not preserved only through Mau's transmission to the Hockulay crew. It continued in Satawal itself, maintained by the community that had never stopped practicing it, and Cesario became one of the primary carriers of the tradition within the Carolinian context. The survival of the knowledge in its original home, alongside its transplantation to Hawaii and the wider Pacific, means that the tradition now exists in multiple forms and in multiple communities, each reinforcing and enriching the others. The revival of Pacific traditional navigation demonstrated something important about preserving knowledge systems that Western education had dismissed. The knowledge survived not in books but in practice, in the bodies and minds of people who kept doing what they knew how to do even when the broader culture denied its value. The survival of the knowledge in Satawal was a consequence of its genuine usefulness there, and of the social structures that maintained its transmission even when the external environment was hostile. A knowledge system that is practiced and valued will survive. One that is only documented may not. Mao Pielug, known to his students and to the world of traditional navigation as Papa Mao, is perhaps the most important figure in the survival of traditional Pacific navigation, and his life and his decision to share his knowledge changed the trajectory of an entire cultural tradition. Mao Pielug was born approximately in 1932 on the small island of Satawal in the Caroline Islands of what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. Satawal is a tiny atoll, less than 2 kilometers long, surrounded by deep ocean on all sides, with no natural resources beyond what the sea and the reef provide and no contact with the wider world except by water. The navigation tradition of Satawal and the surrounding Caroline Islands had been maintained largely intact through the colonial period, protected by the relative geographic isolation of the islands and by the fact that the navigation knowledge was not merely a cultural practice but a practical survival necessity. On Satawal, knowing how to navigate was the difference between life and death. Mao's navigation training began when he was approximately 5 years old, when his grandfather and adoptive father, Rangipi, began teaching him the foundations of the wayfinding system. The training lasted years and followed a traditional curriculum that moved from the memorization of the star compass and the major star paths to the practice of swell reading, from the theoretical framework of the attack system to the practical application of cloud and bird lore. Mao spent years sailing with experienced navigators as a student and crew member before taking charge of his first independent navigation, and he continued to make regular voyages between the Caroline Islands throughout his life, navigating without instruments on every voyage. The decision to teach his knowledge to the Hokulea crew was not an easy one for Mao. The traditional navigation knowledge of the Caroline Islands was, and in some respects still is, a restricted body of knowledge, transmitted only to those who had been formally designated as students and who had undergone the appropriate initiation. Teaching outsiders the traditional knowledge was a significant departure from tradition, and Mao was aware of the cultural implications. What persuaded him, in the end, was his understanding that the knowledge was dying, that the specific conditions that had maintained it in Satawal were not replicable in Hawaii or in the rest of Polynesia, and that the choice was between sharing the knowledge with outsiders who would preserve it in some form or watching it disappear entirely. He chose to share it. He chose to share it. Mao's teaching was not confined to the Hokulea crew. As the wayfinding revival spread through the Pacific, Mao became a central figure in the transmission of the knowledge to navigators from multiple island groups. Not just Hawaii but Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and New Zealand. His willingness to share the knowledge that had been held in his family and his community for generations, transmitted through a tradition that had kept it within a small circle of initiated practitioners, was a decision of cultural generosity that shaped the future of traditional Pacific navigation. He taught not just the specific methods of the Caroline Islands tradition but the deeper principles of wayfinding, the ability to read the environment, to build and maintain a mental model of position, to make decisions under uncertainty, that underlay all the specific techniques. The emotional weight of the 1976 Hokulea voyage for Mao was significant. He had spent his entire life practicing a tradition that his own broader culture, the Western-dominated world of modern Micronesia, regarded as obsolete and quaint. He had never needed anyone outside his own island to validate the knowledge. The knowledge was validated every time he navigated successfully, every time he found the island he was looking for without instruments, every time he brought a crew home safely. But the Hokulea voyage and the reception at Tahiti showed him something he had not expected, that the knowledge he had spent his life practicing was not just locally useful. It was a source of wonder and pride for people who had forgotten it, a connection to their own ancestors that the modern world had severed, and that could be restored. Connection to their own ancestors that the modern world had severed, and that could be restored. The figure of Mao Pielug has become, in the decades since the 1976 voyage, one of the most celebrated individuals in the history of Pacific navigation, and the celebration is deserved, because the decision he made to share his knowledge was genuinely extraordinary. The traditional navigation knowledge of the Caroline Islands was not just culturally sensitive material. It was, in a very real sense, power. The ability to navigate was the ability to move freely across the ocean, to access resources on distant islands, to maintain the trading relationships and the social networks that sustained island communities. A man who could navigate was a man who could go where others could not, and the restriction of navigation knowledge to initiated members of the Navigation Guild was a social mechanism for maintaining the power and the status of the navigators as a distinct and privileged group within their community. Mau Pialug's decision to share his knowledge was therefore not just a personal choice. It was a choice to override the traditional social rules that governed the transmission of that knowledge. He did it because he judged that the alternative, the complete loss of the knowledge, was worse than the disruption to tradition that sharing it represented. It was a pragmatic decision, made in the face of an existential threat to the tradition he loved. And it was the right decision, as the subsequent history of Pacific voyaging demonstrates. The first Hakulei voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 was not merely a successful navigation exercise. It was a cultural event of enormous significance for Hawaiian and Polynesian societies, and its impact reverberated far beyond the world of traditional navigation. The voyage took 33 days, covering approximately 4,300 kilometers across the open ocean between Hawaii and Tahiti. Mau Pialug navigated the entire distance without instruments, using the traditional Carolinian methods he had practiced his entire life, reading the stars, the swells, the clouds, and the birds, maintaining the attack tracking system, and making course adjustments based on his continuously updated model of where the canoe was and where it needed to go. When the Hakulei arrived at Tahiti on June 4, 1976, it was greeted by a crowd estimated at 17,000 people, a significant fraction of the population of Tahiti at the time, who had gathered at the waterfront to witness the arrival. The crowd's reaction was not just enthusiasm for a successful voyage. It was recognition of something that had been denied and forgotten, that the Polynesian ancestors had been capable of this, that the settlement of the Pacific had been a deliberate and skilled achievement, and that the knowledge that made it possible had not entirely disappeared. The voyage had similarly transformative effects in Hawaii, where the Hawaiian cultural revitalization movement was gaining momentum at precisely the moment the Hakulei returned. The canoe's successful navigation became a symbol of the larger project of recovering Hawaiian cultural identity, of demonstrating that the traditional knowledge systems, the traditional arts and practices, the traditional relationships with the ocean and the land, were not primitive survivals from a less sophisticated past but genuine achievements of a complex and capable civilization. The Hakulei's voyage was cited in subsequent years as a catalyst for the Hawaiian Renaissance, the broad cultural and political movement that revitalized the Hawaiian language, traditional practices, and claims to political sovereignty that had been suppressed for over a century. The emotional and political significance of the Hakulei extended far beyond the navigation community to the broader question of Hawaiian sovereignty and identity. The 1970s were a period of intensifying political consciousness among Hawaiian people about the history of American colonization of their islands, the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, the forced annexation in 1898, and the subsequent suppression of Hawaiian language and culture. The Hakulei's successful navigation became evidence in this political argument. Evidence that the Hawaiian ancestors were fully capable of independent, sophisticated achievement, that the colonial narrative of Hawaiian civilization as primitive and in need of European guidance was false, and that the cultural practices and knowledge systems that colonialism had suppressed were worth recovering and celebrating. The Hawaiian language revitalization movement, which has produced, over the past 5 decades, a generation of Hawaiian speakers in a language that was nearly extinct, drew on the same cultural energy as the voyaging movement. the establishment of Hawaiian language immersion schools, the recognition of Hawaiian as an official state language, and the growing insistence on the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in educational curricula all reflect the same understanding that the Hakulei voyage embodied, that the traditional knowledge of the Hawaiian people is a genuine intellectual achievement that deserves the same respect as any other tradition of human knowledge, and that its preservation and transmission are matters of cultural survival, not merely of historical curiosity. The political dimension of the wayfinding revival in Hawaii also connected to the broader Pacific independence and sovereignty movements of the late 20th century. The decolonization of the Pacific Islands, the achievement of independence by Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and other island nations, and the ongoing political struggles of Native Hawaiians for sovereignty within the American state system, gave the cultural revival movements a political urgency that the navigation revival shared. The Hakulei was not just a canoe. It was a political argument, a demonstration that Pacific peoples were capable of independent, sophisticated, self-directed achievement that had nothing to do with the civilizing mission that colonial powers had claimed to be providing. The argument was made not in words but in the physical reality of a canoe navigating the Pacific without instruments, and the argument was unanswerable. The Hakulei's first voyage was also a scientific event of importance for the study of traditional navigation. The successful navigation of 4,300 kilometers of open ocean without instruments, under controlled and documented conditions with observers aboard, provided the first systematic scientific evidence for the effectiveness of the traditional wayfinding methods. Subsequent voyages added to this evidence base, and the detailed accounts of the navigation decisions made during each voyage have been studied by cognitive scientists, anthropologists, and navigation researchers who have used them to understand the specific mechanisms of the wayfinding system. The Hakulei voyages are not just historical and cultural achievements. They are scientific experiments, conducted in real ocean conditions, that have produced a body of evidence about traditional navigation that would otherwise be entirely inaccessible. The transmission of the wayfinding knowledge from Mau-Pielug to a new generation of Hawaiian navigators, and through them to a broader community of Pacific navigators, is a story of cultural recovery that demonstrates both the resilience of traditional knowledge and the specific conditions needed to preserve it. Nainoa Thompson, who became Mau's primary student and the most prominent navigator in the Hawaiian voyaging tradition, began learning wayfinding from Mau in the late 1970s and spent years studying the traditional system, supplementing the traditional knowledge with modern astronomy and oceanography to develop a version of the star compass that was compatible with a modern understanding of the night sky while remaining rooted in the traditional framework. Thompson's approach to the knowledge, his combination of deep respect for the traditional system with a willingness to use modern scientific tools to understand it better, became the model for how the Hawaiian voyaging tradition developed in subsequent decades. Thompson's first solo navigation of the Hakulei on the 1980 voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti was a major milestone in the transmission of the knowledge. He navigated the entire passage without Mau's guidance, using the knowledge he had learned from Mau and the additional understanding he had developed through years of study and practice. The success of the voyage validated the transmission, demonstrated that the knowledge had been successfully communicated from Mau's tradition to a Hawaiian student, and opened the way for the further development of the Hawaiian voyaging tradition that followed. The Polynesian Voyaging Society, founded to build and sail the Hakulei, became the institutional center of the Hawaiian wayfinding revival and eventually a model for similar organizations across the Pacific. Voyaging canoes were built in New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga, Tahiti, and the Cook Islands, and the wayfinding knowledge, taught and shared through the network of Pacific voyagers connected to the Hakulei tradition, began to spread back to the communities whose ancestors had developed it. The sharing of knowledge between different Pacific Island traditions, between the Carolinian navigation system that Mau had taught and the evolving Hawaiian system that Nainoa had developed, produced a synthesis that was richer and more robust than either tradition alone. The role of women in the traditional navigation traditions of the Pacific is a topic that the surviving knowledge preserves only partially, partly because the formal navigation guilds of the Caroline Islands were male-dominated institutions that restricted the full knowledge to initiated male navigators. But the accounts of traditional voyaging make clear that the voyaging canoes carried women on long-distance passages, including colonization voyages, and that women's knowledge of the ocean environment, while differently organized and differently transmitted than the formal navigation knowledge of the guilds, was substantial and practically important. The knowledge of fishing grounds, of the behavior of specific marine species, of the seasonal patterns of ocean productivity, was carried largely by women in many Pacific communities, and this knowledge was as essential to the success of a colonization voyage as the stellar navigation knowledge of the trained wayfinder. The modern wayfinding revival has been more inclusive than the traditional institutions it draws on, with women playing significant roles in the Hockulay voyages and in the teaching and practice of traditional navigation. The Hockulay's 2014 to 2017 World Voyage, a circumnavigation of the globe navigated entirely by traditional methods, the most ambitious traditional navigation project ever undertaken, included women in the crew and the navigation team, continuing the evolution of the tradition beyond the specific social structures within which it originally developed. The knowledge survives in a changed form, adapted to the social realities of the 21st century, but the core, the ability to navigate by the stars, the swells, and the birds, is intact. The worldwide voyage of the Hockulay also demonstrated the global relevance of the wayfinding tradition in a way that the previous Pacific voyages could not. By sailing to every ocean on Earth, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Hockulay showed that the principles of wayfinding were not specific to the Pacific but applicable anywhere that human beings navigate the sea. The navigators who made the voyage learned new ocean environments as they went, applying the same observational and inferential methods that had been developed in the Pacific to the different conditions of other oceans. The star compass needed to be recalibrated for different latitudes. The swell systems were different. The birds were different. But the underlying approach, pay attention to the environment, build and maintain a mental model of your position, make decisions under uncertainty, translated directly. The specific cognitive and mnemonic techniques that Polynesian navigators used to store and access the vast body of knowledge required for wayfinding are among the most interesting aspects of the tradition for cognitive scientists and educators, and they reveal a great deal about the capabilities and the organization of human memory. The Polynesian star compass, the mental model of the 32 bearing points defined by rising and setting stars, is not a simple memorized list but an organized, spatial mental structure that allows rapid and reliable access to any of its components. The star paths, sequences of stars that a navigator follows through the night, each star's rising or setting defining a course bearing that the navigator maintains until the next star takes over, are organized into sequences that follow the natural sequence of stellar risings and settings as the night progresses, making them easier to memorize and retrieve than an unordered list would be. The spatial organization of the knowledge, its organization in terms of the actual spatial relationships of the stars in the sky, takes advantage of the human memory system's particular strength in encoding and retrieving spatially organized information. The knowledge of swell patterns, cloud types, bird behaviors, and current systems was organized and transmitted through oral traditions, through the specific poetry, chants, and navigational formulas that encoded the relevant information in forms that were easy to memorize and transmit. The navigational chants of the Caroline Islands, which encode swell patterns and island locations in poetic form, are functionally equivalent to the navigational charts of European maritime tradition, with the difference that they exist as mental structures encoded in memory rather than physical documents external to the navigator. The relative merits of the two systems are situationally dependent. A physical chart can store more information than any individual can memorize, but a chart can be lost or destroyed while a memory cannot, and a chart requires physical conditions, light, dry, calm, that are not always available in the conditions of open ocean navigation. The transmission of navigational knowledge through oral tradition also created a social dimension that physical documents cannot replicate. The transmission was embedded in a relationship between teacher and student that carried cultural authority and social obligation. The student was not merely acquiring information but entering into a tradition, accepting responsibilities to the knowledge and to the community that the knowledge served. This social embedding made the knowledge more robust in some ways and more fragile in others. More robust because the transmission carried emotional weight and social sanction that made the knowledge worth preserving, and more fragile because the transmission depended on specific social relationships and social structures that were disrupted by colonization and demographic catastrophe. Relationships and social structures that were disrupted by colonization and demographic catastrophe. The modern study of how the traditional navigation knowledge was organized and transmitted has drawn on the tools of cognitive science, linguistics, and educational psychology to understand the mechanisms by which such a large and complex body of knowledge could be maintained in memory and reliably transmitted across generations. The navigational chants of the Caroline Islands, which encode star positions, swell patterns, and island locations in poetic form, have been analyzed by linguists and cognitive scientists who have documented the specific mnemonic techniques embedded in their structure. The use of rhyme and rhythm to create memorable patterns, the use of spatial metaphors to organize positionally related information, the use of narrative structures to connect isolated facts into retrievable sequences. The chants are not merely beautiful poetry. They are precision information storage systems, optimized for the specific characteristics of the human memory system. The application of this understanding to modern education has been one of the more interesting practical outcomes of the study of traditional navigation. Educators who have studied the traditional mnemonic techniques have found that the principles underlying them, the use of spatial organization, narrative structure, and multisensory encoding to make information more memorable, are consistent with the findings of modern cognitive science about what makes learning effective. The traditional navigation curriculum, which takes years and involves both theoretical instruction and extensive practical experience, achieves learning outcomes: the reliable, flexible, and durable retention of large volumes of complex information that modern educational systems struggle to match. The traditional navigators were, among other things, master educators who had developed highly effective pedagogical methods through centuries of empirical testing. The specific body of wayfinding knowledge has also attracted the interest of researchers in artificial intelligence and robotics, who have found in the traditional navigation systems insights about navigating in complex, uncertain environments without precise external reference points. The attack systems approach, using relative rather than absolute position, integrating multiple information streams, maintaining an explicit model of uncertainty, has been described by robotics researchers as a form of probabilistic inference that is more robust to sensor noise than the dead reckoning approaches most autonomous navigation systems use. The traditional navigators, working with no external infrastructure, developed strategies for robust navigation under uncertainty that modern robotics is only beginning to match. The Viking navigators of the North Atlantic represent a parallel tradition of sophisticated open ocean navigation that, like the Polynesian tradition, was developed independently of European scientific astronomy and that achieved remarkable results with methods that differ fundamentally from those of the European navigational tradition. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic, from Scandinavia to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to the coast of North America, required navigation across open ocean at high latitudes where the conditions are very different from the tropics. The North Atlantic is characterized by fog, overcast skies, and rapidly changing weather that frequently eliminate the visual references, stars, sun, horizon, that are the primary tools of open ocean navigation. The Norse navigators developed specific techniques for these conditions that allowed them to maintain their course and find their destination despite the challenging environment. The solar compass, a wooden disc with a central gnomon whose shadow's position indicated the direction of the sun even in overcast conditions when the sun was invisible, was one of the Norse navigation tools. A fragment of what may be such a device was found at a Greenlandic Norse site and has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of the Norse solar compass described in the sagas. The Norse navigators also used the sunstone, a birefringent crystal of calcite or similar material that polarizes light and can be used to determine the direction of the sun even through cloud cover by detecting the pattern of polarized light in the sky. Experimental studies have demonstrated that the sunstone method is effective at determining solar direction to within a few degrees in overcast conditions, and the method would have been sufficient to maintain course across the North Atlantic. The Norse navigation also drew heavily on environmental knowledge similar in its structure to the Polynesian wayfinding tradition. Knowledge of the migration routes of seabirds, knowledge of the patterns of sea ice and sea temperature, knowledge of the color and behavior of the ocean at specific locations. The Norse sagas describe navigational landmarks, specific cloud formations over Iceland's glaciers, the distinctive green color of the Greenland current, the behavior of specific bird species at different distances from land, that served the same function for Norse navigators as the corresponding environmental knowledge served for Polynesian ones. The methods were different because the ocean was different, but the underlying approach, systematic observation of the environment, organized into a knowledge system that could be transmitted and applied, was the same. Environment, organized into a knowledge system that could be transmitted and applied, was the same. The specific navigational knowledge of the Norse is documented not just in the archaeological record and the sagas, but in a remarkable medieval Scandinavian source, The King's Mirror, a 13th-century Norwegian text that includes detailed practical advice for sailors crossing the North Atlantic, including advice on reading the weather, identifying sea ice, navigating in fog, and coping with the magnetic anomalies of the high North Atlantic. The King's Mirror's navigation advice is embedded in a broader discussion of cosmology and natural philosophy that reflects the Norse understanding of the physical world, and it reveals a tradition of systematic observation and practical knowledge transmission that parallels the oral traditions of the Pacific navigators in its structure and in its objectives. The comparison of the Norse and Polynesian navigation traditions is instructive because it reveals both the universality of the wayfinding approach, systematic observation of the natural environment, organized into a knowledge system optimized for the specific conditions of the navigator's ocean, and the specific adaptations that each tradition made to its particular environment. The Norse navigators emphasized solar and magnetic direction finding because the North Atlantic's high latitudes and frequent overcast made stellar navigation unreliable. The Polynesian navigators emphasized swell reading and biological indicators because the tropical Pacific's clear skies made stellar navigation their primary tool, but the vast distances required multiple backup systems for the conditions when the stars were not visible. Both traditions solved the same fundamental problem: how to find your way across a featureless ocean without instruments, through the same fundamental approach, but with techniques specifically adapted to the conditions of their respective oceans. The Norse navigators' use of ravens for navigation is one of the most famous examples of bird-based navigation in the non-Polynesian traditions. The sagas describe Norse navigators releasing ravens at sea to determine the direction of the nearest land. If the raven flew off in a specific direction and did not return, land was in that direction. If the raven circled and returned to the ship, land was not within flight range. The use of ravens in this way is consistent with the known behavior of ravens, which are territorial land birds that will fly toward land when released at sea and that have a homing instinct that brings them back to the ship if no land is found. The technique is less precise than the Polynesian use of specific migratory species, but it represents the same fundamental approach, using the behavior of living animals as indicators of navigational information that is otherwise unavailable to human senses. The Arab navigators of the Indian Ocean developed yet another independent tradition of sophisticated astronomical navigation that was, in some respects, the most technically advanced of the pre-instrumental traditions, incorporating explicit use of the altitude of stars above the horizon as a quantitative measure of latitude. The Arab navigation tradition in the Indian Ocean dates from at least the early centuries of the Common Era, when Arab traders established regular routes between the Arabian Peninsula, East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia using the predictable monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. The monsoon system, the seasonal reversal of winds driven by the differential heating of the Asian continent and the Indian Ocean, made the Indian Ocean a relatively predictable sailing environment compared to the Pacific, and the regularity of the winds allowed Arab navigators to plan their voyages around the seasonal wind patterns rather than fighting against them. The Arab navigational literature, preserved in texts like the manuals of the great 15th-century navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, who is credited with guiding Vasco da Gama's fleet across the Indian Ocean after rounding the Cape of Good Hope, describes a system of navigation based on the altitude of the pole star above the horizon, measured using a simple instrument called a kamal, a wooden tablet on a string, held at arm's length, that could be used to measure the angle between the pole star and the horizon with a precision of about 1 degree. Since the altitude of the pole star equals the observer's latitude, the Kamal measurement provided a direct and quantitative determination of the navigator's north-south position. The Arab navigators combined the Kamal latitude measurement with an extensive knowledge of the seasonal star patterns, the monsoon wind cycles, and the specific routes and hazards of the Indian Ocean to produce a complete navigation system that was considerably more sophisticated than the contemporary European system, which relied primarily on compass bearings and dead reckoning without systematic latitude measurement. The navigational knowledge of Ibn Majid and his contemporaries was so advanced that when Vasco da Gama's fleet appeared on the East African coast in 1498, the local Arab navigators immediately recognized that the Portuguese had no idea where they were going and that guide services would be commercially valuable. The encounter between European and Arab navigation traditions in the Indian Ocean was not an encounter between a sophisticated tradition and a primitive one. It was an encounter between two sophisticated traditions, one of which was somewhat more advanced. It was an encounter between two sophisticated traditions, one of which was somewhat more advanced. The specific navigational achievement of Ibn Majid's guidance of da Gama's fleet is worth examining in detail, because it illustrates the practical superiority of the Arab navigation system at that moment in history. Da Gama's fleet had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, an extraordinary achievement of Portuguese seamanship, but it was entirely unprepared for the Indian Ocean, whose monsoon winds, complex current systems, and intricate geography were entirely outside the knowledge of European navigators of the time. The fleet's navigators were using dead reckoning and compass bearings, methods adequate for the Atlantic but insufficient for the Indian Ocean's seasonal wind reversals and the long ocean crossings required to reach India from the East African coast. Ibn Majid, who encountered da Gama at Malindi on the East African coast, understood immediately what the Portuguese needed and was willing to provide it, presumably for substantial payment, as navigational knowledge was a commercially valuable commodity in the Indian Ocean trade system. The Arab navigation tradition's use of stellar altitude measurement, the Kamal technique, represented a genuine quantitative advance over both the Celtic dead reckoning of the Atlantic and the qualitative stellar bearing system of the Pacific navigators. By measuring the altitude of the pole star, Arab navigators could determine their latitude to within a degree or two and use that information to plan courses that maintained a specific latitude, a technique called latitude sailing that gave navigators a much more reliable method of making long-distance passages than pure dead reckoning. The Portuguese subsequently adopted and refined this latitude sailing technique, and it became the foundation of the European astronomical navigation system that eventually produced the sextant, the chronometer, and the fully quantitative navigation system that the Polynesian wayfinding tradition rivals but does not resemble. System that the Polynesian wayfinding tradition rivals but does not resemble. The encounter between the Arab and European navigation traditions in the Indian Ocean also illustrates the way that the transfer of navigational knowledge between traditions could accelerate technical development. The Portuguese adoption of Arab latitude sailing techniques, combined with their own developments in compass navigation, produced the celestial navigation system that became the foundation of European maritime expansion. The specific innovation the Portuguese added was the use of the noon altitude of the sun, rather than the pole star, as a latitude indicator, extending the technique to the southern hemisphere. This innovation allowed the systematic exploration that produced the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese success depended on Arab knowledge. Arab knowledge depended on Babylonian and Indian astronomical tradition, and the entire edifice rested on thousands of years of accumulated observation stretching back into the pre-instrumental period. The modern scientific understanding of how the Polynesian navigators navigated, the reconstruction of the traditional knowledge system through ethnographic study, experimental voyaging, and cognitive science, has revealed a system of remarkable elegance and effectiveness, and has changed the way scientists and educators think about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge. The work of the anthropologist David Lewis, who sailed with Polynesian and Micronesian navigators in the 1960s and 1970s and documented the traditional navigation methods in his 1972 book We, the Navigators, was foundational in establishing the credibility of the wayfinding tradition for Western scholarly audiences. Lewis's accounts of traditional navigators performing feats of positional accuracy that rivaled the performance of instrument-equipped vessels were initially met with skepticism, but subsequent research and the successful navigation of the Hockulay and other reconstructed voyaging canoes validated his observations. The cognitive science of wayfinding, the study of how the human mind acquires, stores, and applies the knowledge needed for navigation, has been transformed by the study of traditional Pacific navigation. The traditional navigators' use of egocentric reference frames, the attack system's treatment of the navigator as stationary and the islands as moving, is now recognized as a cognitively efficient strategy for tracking position in conditions where the navigator's own movement is the primary variable. The attack framework also has the advantage of naturally incorporating the navigator's uncertainty about position. In the attack model, the navigator does not need to know their absolute position. They need to know only the bearing and estimated distance to the destination, which can be continuously updated from the available environmental information without requiring a precise fix on the current location. This focus on relative rather than absolute position is more cognitively tractable in the conditions of open ocean navigation, where absolute position cannot be determined exactly, and it produces navigation behavior that is more robust to uncertainty than the European system, which requires a precise position fix as the basis for all subsequent course calculations. Modern cognitive scientists have found that human beings are naturally better at tracking the movement of objects relative to themselves than at tracking their own movement through a fixed landscape, and the attack system exploits this cognitive tendency to produce a more accurate and less cognitively demanding positional tracking system than the standard European approach. The study of traditional navigation has also contributed to the development of a broader understanding of what researchers now call indigenous ecological knowledge, the systematic, detailed, empirically validated understanding of natural systems that indigenous communities have accumulated through generations of careful observation and transmission. The navigation knowledge of the Pacific Islanders is one of the most impressive examples of indigenous ecological knowledge, but it is not unique. Similar bodies of systematic knowledge about the natural world have been documented in indigenous communities on every continent, covering topics from the behavior of specific animal species to the distribution of medicinal plants to the prediction of weather and natural hazards. The recognition that this knowledge is genuinely scientific, that it is based on observation, tested by experience, and organized into coherent systems of understanding, has been one of the more important intellectual developments in the relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge traditions. One of the more important intellectual developments in the relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge traditions. The Hockulay 2014 to 2017 World Voyage, the Malama Honua Voyage, meaning to care for the island Earth, was the most ambitious traditional navigation project in history, taking the canoe and its crew around the globe over 3 years, making 60 stops in 26 countries, and navigating entirely by traditional methods throughout. The voyage was conceived not just as a navigation achievement but as a statement about the relationship between indigenous knowledge, environmental stewardship, and global responsibility. The idea that the skills and sensibility of the traditional navigator, the attention to the natural world, the ability to read the environment, the understanding of the ocean as a living system that rewards care and attention, were not just historically interesting but urgently relevant to the challenges of the 21st century was central to the voyage's message. The reception of the Malama Honua voyage around the world demonstrated the resonance of this message. In community after community, the arrival of the Hokule prompted conversations about indigenous knowledge, about the relationship between human societies and the natural world, and about the specific loss that the suppression of traditional knowledge systems represented. The voyaging canoe and its navigators became ambassadors for a way of knowing the world that had been dismissed and nearly lost, but that had survived and was now, unmistakably, alive and functional and sailing. The message was carried not in words but in the physical reality of the canoe itself, a vessel designed and built according to traditional principles, navigated by traditional methods, making a successful circumnavigation of the earth. The proof was in the performance. The story of Polynesian navigation is ultimately a story about what it means to know something, about the different forms that knowledge can take, the different systems through which knowledge can be transmitted, and the specific vulnerabilities of knowledge systems that depend on living human beings rather than physical documents for their existence. The Polynesian navigators knew the Pacific in a way that no chart or instrument could fully capture. Their knowledge was not a collection of facts about the stars and the swells and the birds. It was a dynamic, living model of the ocean environment, continuously updated by experience and continuously applied to the practical challenge of finding their way. It was knowledge in the deepest sense. Not information about the world, but the ability to engage with the world effectively, to read what the world was telling them and to respond appropriately. This kind of knowledge, embodied, practical, continuously exercised, is different from the kind that can be written in a book, and its near loss was a different kind of loss from the loss of a library. The recovery of the wayfinding tradition by Nainoa Thompson, by the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and by the network of Pacific navigators who have learned and practiced and taught the traditional methods over the past 50 years is one of the most remarkable stories of cultural resilience in the modern world. It is a story of knowledge that survived, barely, in the mind of one man on a small island in the western Pacific, and that was recognized in time and transmitted to a new generation who have carried it forward, who have sailed it across the Pacific in reconstructed canoes, who have taught it to their own students and who will pass it on to theirs. Mau Pielug died in 2010, at approximately 78 years of age, having sailed traditional voyages his entire life and having transmitted the knowledge of the Caroline Islands wayfinding tradition to a community of navigators who continue to practice it. His student Nainoa Thompson has navigated the Hokule across the Pacific dozens of times and has trained a new generation of Hawaiian navigators who carry the tradition forward. The knowledge that was almost lost is not quite the same as the knowledge that was nearly lost. It has been modified by the encounter with modern astronomy and oceanography, adapted to the cultural context of 21st century Hawaii, and changed by the act of becoming explicit and teachable in ways that the original transmission never required. But it is alive. The canoes are sailing. The stars are in their places. And the navigators who can find their way by reading them are, once again, at sea. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more traditions of knowledge that nearly disappeared, more achievements of human intelligence that the conventional history has underestimated or ignored. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect, always going further than you expect. The ocean that the first Polynesian navigators crossed 3,000 years ago is the same ocean that the Hokule crosses today. The stars that guided the first Hawaii voyagers are the same stars that Nainoa Thompson used to navigate from Tahiti to Hawaii in 1980. The swells that a Caroline Islands navigator reads to locate a distant island are the same swells that Mau Pielug felt through the hull of a canoe on his first passage as a young man. The knowledge that was nearly lost and partially recovered connects the navigators of the present to the navigators of the deep past in a chain of transmission that has, against all odds, survived. What the navigators carry is not just a technical skill. It is a relationship, a specific way of being in the world, of paying attention to the world, of understanding oneself as part of a larger system of relationships between the human, the natural, and the celestial. The Pacific Ocean, for the navigator who has learned to read it, is not an empty expanse of water. It is a landscape as rich and as legible as any terrestrial environment, full of signs and signals and information for those who know how to read them. The navigator who crosses the Pacific without instruments is not performing a feat of technology. They are performing a feat of knowledge, of knowing where they are because they know the ocean, and knowing the ocean because they have spent their lives learning to pay attention to it in a very particular way. That way of paying attention, patient, multisensory, continuously updated, deeply humble before the complexity of the natural world, is one of the most valuable things that the traditional navigation tradition has to offer the modern world. Not as a substitute for GPS and satellites, which are better at what they do than any human navigator can be, but as a reminder that the knowledge of the natural world that human beings accumulated over millennia of careful observation is not obsolete, not primitive, not inferior to the knowledge encoded in instruments and algorithms. It is different, organized differently, transmitted differently, stored differently. And it is, in its own domain and on its own terms, extraordinary.